Joe Biden, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Chinese Premier Qiang, and heads of invited countries like Bangladesh and Mauritius have all arrived in New Delhi. They witnessed cultural programs on tarmac at the airport and 3 bilaterals with Prime Minister Narendra Modi at Lok Kalyan Marg, which is the official residence of Prime Minister of India, are over already. Hello everyone and welcome to the special broadcast on G20. Delhi Declaration is almost ready, is what G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant has said. What are the points of agreements? And what about the disagreements? First, let's listen in to what Mr. Kant had to say.
The New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, which many of you will see post the summit, you will see it as a voice of the global south and the developing countries. No document in the world would have such a strong voice for the global south and the developing countries as the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. New Delhi Leaders' Declaration is almost ready. I would not like to dwell on it because this declaration will be recommended to the leaders and the leaders will then accept it. And only after it has been accepted by the leaders.
And today was also the day when Prime Minister, while welcoming the dignitaries, spelt out the mantra for this summit. He put out a detailed thread on X saying India's G20 presidency has been inclusive, ambitious, decisive and action-oriented. Prime Minister Modi had 3 bilaterals, about which I just spoke. In all, there are 15, which will happen in the next 48 hours. Engagement with Prime Minister Jagannath of Mauritius, in fact, focused on cooperation in sectors like infrastructure, fintech, and reiteration of India's commitment to furthering the voice of the global south. With Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh, it was on connectivity and commercial linkages. And then the big handshake over dinner with US President Joe Biden. The agenda was trade issues, jet engine, and also on technology cooperation under the initiative on critical and emerging technology. Tomorrow is the day of negotiations and discussions. Lots of visuals have already come in. There'll be lots of visuals also coming in tomorrow. Joining me on the show, Michael Kugelman is South Asia Institute Director of the Wilson Center. We have Ambassador Manjeev Puri. He is India's former representative to the UN and Nepal. Dr. Bharat Barai is member of Overseas Friends of BJP. We have Andrew K.P. Leung, China strategist. I'm going to begin with you, Ambassador Puri. The New Delhi Declaration is almost ready, is the message that is coming from the Sherpa of G20, and it will be taken up for discussion tomorrow. What is it that the world wants out of this G20 New Delhi?
Thank you very much for the question. And I think we have to go by the words of the Sherpa. And he said that this will be a very strong document reflecting the voice of the global south. And I want to believe that actually the world also wants to do something which is for the global south, because time today is such. It's a time requiring cooperation, collaboration, and doing things together. Let me give you one simple example. The issue of climate change, which, we all talk about in various ways. But let's look at our friends in Africa, who recently had, just a few days back, had a huge, big African climate convention. The world is generally ready to do something. Ways and means have to be found in which we manage to do that. And the G20 is a perfect forum for that. So my understanding is that the world wants to see that we bring about cooperation that is important for the entire world, important for the global south. Let me highlight just a few things. The issue of digital public infrastructure, where India has been a human leader of the world in terms of what we have done. The issue of women to lead developmental efforts. The issue of cryptocurrencies. And in fact, the biggest of them all in that sense, money for sustainable development, seeing that the SDGs are brought back on target and monies for green climate development. These are some of the big issues, and I think that the world generally is on one page. I have the Sherpa's word for it, and I am happy to take it for that.
Okay, let me ask Michael Kugelman, is the world really on one page? Let's not forget that there is absence, the visible absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin as well.
Well, I mean, I think the world is on the same page in a very broad, lowest common denominator context, in that I would argue that all the G20 members would agree in principle on the need to address global challenges like climate change and food insecurity and so on. But I think that in terms of the agenda items that all the members would like to focus on at the summit, then no, I mean, they're certainly not on the same page. And I would make the point that at root here is a definitional issue. When the G20 was first formed, the idea was for members to come together and figure out ways to cooperate economically to tackle the biggest global challenges. And I think that today there's not an agreement around the world, and certainly within the GP and the G20, on what those biggest global challenges are, right? Washington and it's many of its Western allies in the G20 would say it's Ukraine. We've got to deal with that. Whereas, of course, a number of countries would say, no, that's a European war. It should not be the biggest global challenge to tackle. So India's role, of course, is to navigate all of that and to try to figure out how to gently, carefully bring this very rivalry-driven, tense grouping of members together in some type of general consensus.
And among all the bilaterals, Mr. Leung, which one is it that is being watched and read very closely in China? Will it be this one, the visuals of which are on our television screens?
Well, I don't think it will be on Premier Li Qiang alone. But of course, this is a forum hosted by India, and where the presence of the United States is very, very strong together with its allies. And there is no doubt that the United States wants to use this forum to counter China's influence in the global South. Don't forget that before coming to Delhi, President Biden has already coming up with various initiatives to, for example, on the infrastructural development, the so-called Partnership for Global Infrastructure Development, purporting to raise $600 billion by 2027 to counter China's Belt and Road. To the extent that with the rhetoric or the narrative that a Belt and Road is not sustainable in many ways and is not open enough. But if these kind of languages are written into the proposed statement, then there is very little chance that that China or other countries sympathetic to China's interests would agree. So I think that there is a great deal of vast amount of ground on which most countries would agree, and as highlighted just now, the climate change and also sustainable development. And in fact, the sustainable development goals of the United Nations.
And will China also agree, Mr. Leung, that India's G20 presidency has been the one of new initiatives and achievements?
Well, I don't think that China would oppose India's chairmanship, considering it is by rotation. And of course, China's embraces the globalization interventions.
In terms of what India managed to achieve, and send that message, how it is the voice of the voiceless, the voice of the global South, the achievements with regards to financial inclusion, and all this is coming on a day that World Bank has lauded India's what it says has been a transformative impact of DPIs, which is the digital public infrastructure.
Well, of course, China's very active on bringing about a more equitable world in which the voice of the global South will be given adequate sway rather than being under the thumb of a sole hegemon. And as far as finance is concerned, one of the worries of the global South is that the US dollar, which has been dominant in the global financial transactions, has been weaponized, and then it tends to encroach on the sovereignty rights of developing countries, including China, of course. So I think that China, and as exemplified by the recent meeting of the BRICS Plus summit, more and more countries in the global south want to line up to join the BRICS, suggesting that they don't want to be held to ransom by a hegemonic world order. So I think that both India and China can play a role in this.
Okay.
But let's make no mistake. This is a platform addressing global issues. There's also a platform for the battle for the global south, in which the United States and of course countries like China and India are extremely interested and involved.
So you are essentially saying that this is almost like a forum to lead the global south, but the fact is that India is leading the global south, isn't it, Dr. Barai? In January, those 125 nations that came together, the fact that India managed to convince other members in the BRICS to expand, the first in terms of scheduling also, many would say that it has to do with when the leaders arrive, but the fact is that the first meeting that the Prime Minister had among the bilaterals was with his Mauritian counterpart. Dr. Barai.
Yes, you are right. India was a developing country. Now it is in transition, and India has a good friendship in both Asia as well as Africa, and it's trying to champion the cause of those countries who have challenges, who have not been well represented. Their voice has not been well represented at the world level. So I think it was great that the BRIC has been expanded now to 11 countries. And here also, Prime Minister Modi has invited 9 other countries, more from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, to participate in the G20, so the problems of the South can be addressed more at the global level. So that way, India deserves the credit for bringing it to the attention of other members of G20.
Okay. Let me go back to Michael Kugelman and Ambassador Puri. Ambassador Puri, I'm going to refer to this World Bank document which came on a very, very important day, just hours before the summit is to begin, and on the day when 3 crucial bilaterals have already taken place. It says that India managed to achieve in 6 years what other countries would have done in about 5 decades.
Maria, look, we have been pioneers in this digital public infrastructure. You and I are beneficiaries of it, isn't it? Otherwise, would we have been able to sustain ourselves through the COVID lockdowns, the India stack, the use of UPI? Anywhere you go, you can use digital payments today in India. You know, we have leveraged this technology, and let us be very clear, we have every reason to be proud, but the most beautiful part of it is that we have made these technologies available to everybody in the world. Whoever wants in many countries have chosen to take it. And so the World Bank has very rightly identified India and recognized India for what it's done for its people, and is a signal for the rest of the developing world, and by developing world, including the developed world, that look, here there is an achievement which can be seen, which is there for everyone and for everyone to take advantage of. Please do so. It's an India success story.
And as we look at the New Delhi declaration, Michael, the Russian media, Russian state media, in fact, to be specific, is saying that the US and UK are pressurizing India. G7 countries pressurizing India on Ukraine, while India is trying to maintain neutral course. How should this be viewed?
Well, I mean, that's a predictable response from the Russian media. But look, I mean, we know that the U.S. and the U.K. and other Western members are going to want to have Ukraine front and center at this summit. And I think that the argument that Washington and London and others would make that the G20 is about tackling economic challenges. And regardless of what you think about the war in Ukraine, it has provoked a lot of economic stress and economic crises for countries around the world, particularly in the global south. If you talk about the inflation and all of that, it hits harder in the global south. So I think that would be the argument from the U.S. and its Western partners, that this is not about trying to focus on the war in Ukraine. It's about doing what the G20 can do to try to bring relief to those impacted economically by this war. But again, I think that for India, the goal here is to try to erect a firewall between difficult geopolitical issues like the war in Ukraine and somewhat of the more lower-hanging fruits, the non-geopolitical issues like food insecurity, and figuring out how to elevate those to the top of the agenda at this summit.
But Michael, the fact is that DPI cannot be really seen as low-hanging fruit. Even the MDBs, the fact is that these banks have to understand the new age or emerging challenges that are coming from African nations. And if India manages to send that message of greater inclusivity for financial inclusion, then don't you think that will be a huge political and diplomatic success for India?
Right, so you made a very important point. I'm glad that you corrected me. I mean, I don't think there is anything like, there's no such thing as low-hanging fruit in this summit, because there's so many tensions and rivalries around anything that it's going to be difficult for anything to be easy, and that certainly includes the broader issue of development assistance. And I think it's quite clear that the developing countries within the G20 and the global south would like the Western countries, the richer countries, to provide more assistance for climate change, for food insecurity, and so on, than the richer countries are comfortable with. So that's just, that's one big example right there. Your example was clear as well. This just gets to the challenge that New Delhi has here as the host, of trying to figure out how to generate some type of broader understanding, not necessarily a hard 100% agreement, but some type of general understanding around shared principles that could be highlighted in a joint communique. And since they think there is a lot of support within the G20 for India's goal of trying to focus on addressing global South needs, I think that will be a good starting point, and hopefully that will result in some type of agreement to at least agree to the idea of this forum, this very prestigious, wealthy, influential forum,
yes,
to bring more assistance to the global South.
And it sends a message and sets the roadmap for the world in terms of its financial challenges. And on our television screens now is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's tweet with regards to the bilateral which he had with President Joe Biden. He's saying, happy to have welcomed porters Joe Biden to 7 Lok Kalyan Marg. Our meeting was very productive. We were able to discuss numerous topics which will further economic and people-to-people linkages between India and USA. The friendship between our nations will continue to play a great role in furthering global good. Andrew Kipping Leong, I'm coming to you again on this. Every word here will be watched very closely, and I will certainly highlight the bonhomie that is on display.
Well, this no doubt highlights the strategic importance the Chinese leadership views this G20 in the sense that this is a platform probably used by the United States along with its Western allies and also its Indian allies to further Western agenda in a position to want to perceive to be China's failings in terms of the Belt and Road development, in terms of the trade practices. But I think that I've no doubt that if there's going to be a common statement, then strong words like this will not appear. I think what are going to appear are likely to be actionable general principles, which most people would agree. But then these principles could be used to highlight the conflict between the United States and China, and of course, to a certain extent, the war in Ukraine. But most of all, apart from these problematic areas, I think there is a great deal of of common ground on agendas like climate change, sustainable development, and as I was saying, the other sustainable development goals.
So the SDG goals are important, multilateral development, banks, and how these institutions should realize, that it should become more efficient. All that is a focus. But coming on this, the point that is being made, Dr. Barai, here is also of the personal connect that is visible in this entire G20 summit. Would you say that that look east policy that is on display, the fact that Prime Minister Modi says, look towards your neighbors first policy, you have here Sheikh Hasina being invited and she was there at the bilateral which happened at LKM. Do you think that personal connect has meant that he is able to leverage his position and on the diplomatic landscape better?
Maria, you hit it right on the bullseye. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has developed personal bonhomie between himself and many, many leaders of the world, starting with President Biden. He even has a good relationship with President Putin and many other leaders that you mentioned about, both our neighbors and those are our distant neighbors. So you can get many things done as friends, then you can get it done as a diplomat or, of course, as a foe. And he has been leveraging his personal friendship, personal good charm that he has developed with the world leaders to try to get many things done. We have seen that he has done the same thing with the Indian diaspora. He has done the same thing with the world leaders, and I commend him for his camaraderie.
Okay, I have just enough time for the final word from Ambassador Puri, Michael Kugelman, and Andrew Leong. Michael Kugelman, would you really want, Delhi declaration, perhaps a joint statement that would be the real success? Or would you say that in this 10 months, India has sent enough and more messages of its diplomatic success of G20 presidency, and that will be perhaps just the icing on the cake?
Well, I agree that we shouldn't place too much stock in the need to get some type of final consensus document, though it still is very important. I mean, given the past history that, whenever you've had a G20 leaders summit, there typically has been some type of joint communique, including last year in Indonesia when, many of the current geopolitical rivalries playing out were very sharp then as well. And I think it is possible. And one thing that was clever about the Bali Declaration last year is that it was very transparent about where there was not agreement between the members. It would talk about most members agreeing to, many members agreeing to. Nothing wrong with using that kind of language. I just think the optics of, pulling out all the stops and investing so many resources and political capital in this summit and then not having a final consensus product, the optics of that would not be very good. So that's why I'm quite confident that there will be some type of document, even though it will likely reflect a partial consensus and an agreement on principles and not a full 100% consensus, which is fine.
Okay, Manjeev Puri, I have just 10 seconds for you and then the final word to Mr. Leong.
Maria, look, obviously a consensus communique is something that everybody would like.
Yes.
Having said this, let me make the point. The G20 is not a treaty-based body.
That's right.
Here, countries come together and agree to work together, either domestically or in the relevant de jure bodies where action has to be taken. In my understanding, the fact that generally on a number of subjects which are important to the global south, which are important to the globe as such, whether it is climate finance, sustainability, whether it is cryptocurrencies, digital public, there is general agreement. And I think, let's keep this politics business a little out. If it happens, well and good. If it doesn't, we have made tremendous progress, and the world, or rather the most important countries in the world, are at least in principle on for some of the most important things. I'm not wanting to use the word low-hanging fruits, but perhaps the largest and most important fruits for humankind.
A success of India's presidency may not go down very well with its neighbors, because of the understanding or lack of it that's there. But certainly, when the world sees it, it will be seen as a diplomatic success, particularly from the point of view of India having managed to convince these superpowers that African nations must be heard.
Sorry, are you addressing me?
Yes.
Yes, well, thank you. Well, I think that too much has been invested in the G20 by President Modi for it not resulting in a joint agreed statement. In fact, most of the world expect there's going to be a statement. And of course, Beijing wants something agreed with the Global South as well. So the trick is really to stay away from the minefields and concentrating on the broad areas of broad agreement like climate change, and also sustainable development, and also doing something about the finance that are much needed by the poorest developing nations. So I think that there's a lot of momentum there, in China included, for there's going to be a statement. And Beijing is unlikely to envy Modi's success, because after all, this is a rotation, platform by rotation. So I'm hopeful that there will be a statement and addressing some of the pressing issues, but not flagging up, using this as an opportunity to flag up a lot of the inevitable or intractable conflicts.
All right, Andrew K.P. Leung, Dr. Barai, Ambassador Puri, and Michael, thank you so much for your time.